Hey everybody, it is March 2020 and it is time for another episode of Hail State Debate on our brand new resolution for public forum in March, which is resolved the United States should increase its use of nuclear energy for commercial energy production. Obviously I have Alicia Brown with me. My name is Brett Harvey, and right off the bat I want to say we are both, I think, fair to say, eminently qualified to talk on this topic, if I may be so bold. Alicia is the winner of the prestigious Truman Scholarship, largely on a platform of energy policy, whereas I have played all three of the most recent games in the Fallout series, which is overwhelmingly about nuclear energy.
I've only played the third game, so I'm not quite as qualified on that front, but I have studied nuclear a lot. I'm really excited for this topic. I give it an 8 or 9 out of 10, which is really welcome after last month's pretty bad topic.
I feel like maybe this is kind of a sort of a making up for last month's really difficult topic. It's balanced. You know, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's steady, it's stable, you know what you're getting from it. It's got good ground on both sides.
Was stable a pun, because nuclear energy is unstable?
No, I'm not sophisticated enough to do the nuclear puns. We're going to have to leave those to you. But at any rate, you know, as always on this channel, this is a channel for everybody in debate, whether you come from a big program, a small program, no program, you're out there debating on your own. We want it to be useful to you. If it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. As always, we will put all the links that we cite and all the timestamps down in the description below. And if you're interested in keeping up with our general thoughts on debate, thoughts on topic selections, things like that, we are on Twitter at Hail State Debate. So with that, we will jump right into some initial thoughts, and I will defer to the expert.
So the initial thought on this one is, like Brett said, this is a really balanced topic, which is great for the AF and the neg. There's a few ways you can be creative that we'll get into later. But just starting with the initial thought, your biggest challenge here is you're going to need to be able to explain this topic. It's a pretty technical topic to your judge. You may be throwing around capacity terms like megawatts to describe the size of plants. You might be talking about megawatt hours to describe amounts of energy that those plants produce. And you're going to need to be able to contextualize that for your judge. What's big, what's small, like what really matters. So just as a quick primer on that, megawatts is what we use for capacity. And for a nuclear plant, that's typically in the neighborhood of 600 to 1,500 megawatts is your standard nuclear plant. So that's a pretty big amount. That's enough to power many hundred thousands of homes. Whereas for wind and solar, you're probably looking at your average turbine produces about 2 megawatts for a wind turbine, and your average solar panels probably about 100 kilowatts per panel. And a kilowatt is 1/1000th of a megawatt. So that's what capacity is. That's the maximum amount of energy that a wind turbine nuclear reactor could produce. Now, the energy itself is referred to in time units. So it's that amount of capacity times the time. So for a nuclear plant, you might get 150,000 megawatt hours of energy out of it over a certain time period. So all that does is that takes the capacity times how often the plant is running times how long it ran.
And there are a lot of concepts, I think, like even I as a layperson in the field of energy policy, you know, you can talk about things like what is the difference between, you know, types of energy that are fluctuating, for example, like solar, and what you would call more like a baseload energy, something that's always on. And we're going to talk about that as we go through it, but I think it is really important for you to have a clear picture of what those things are, not just to the point where you sort of vaguely understand it in your head, but being ready to explain those concepts if you happen to get into, even if it's not a big part of your case, right, if you happen to get into a fight about it in a crossfire or on a particular contention, the more time you invest in understanding them, the better off you will be. So as for me, my initial thoughts are much more sort of pedestrian and about kind of debate thoughts. The first one I have is to be aware of the different types of sources you're going to encounter on this. There's a ton of information out there. There's a huge body of literature. But one thing to be aware of here, as with any topic about one particular industry, is there are going to be industry groups out there that are going to be providing information. They're going to be providing sources. And in any field like nuclear energy where there's a lot of money at stake, those industry groups are going to be providing information. Critics would call it propaganda. Others would say it's just, you know, sort of interested parties making their case. But you need to be aware that, for example, the Nuclear Energy Institute is basically the information distribution arm of the nuclear industry in the United States, and that the World Nuclear Association is a global body that does that. And when they produce information, it is going to be in favor of the nuclear industry. Now, that doesn't mean that you can never use these sources. As Alicia pointed out to me the other day, they do some really, you know, interesting research, and they have a lot of facts condensed into one place. And if we're talking about like a statistic or a number that can be verified externally, then that's fine, but you need to be aware that these sources have their biases. Now, if you want to be a little bit more opportunistic, if somebody is citing one of the Nuclear Energy Institute or the World Nuclear Association, you can, try to make a little hay out of that in Crossfire. You can say, who funds them? Where do they get their money from? Can we really expect them to be unbiased? But if you can use other sources for the same information, you probably want to. Just be wary of that.
Yeah, so the way you really decide like which sources from those trade groups that you can use is it quantitative or qualitative? Yeah. I mean, if it's a number that they had to do data analysis to get, or it's a number about the number of plants or how often they're operating, those are pretty good statistics that you can rely on. And if your opponent calls you out for it, you can almost make a joke and kind of roll your eyes about it. It's like, are you really questioning that this source is wrong about the number of plants in the United States? Right. I mean, how can we mess that up? How can that be biased?
Yeah, if they're
Make
saying,
them look silly.
Yeah, if they're saying like nuclear power is just the greatest thing in the world according to the Nuclear Energy Institute, fair enough. But if they're saying we produce X number of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, well, come on, that's probably accurate.
Right, so what you need to look out for is qualitative arguments that like nuclear is the be-all, end-all, the only carbon-free energy source we can count on. You better back that up with something else.
Right. Last opening thought that I have is this is going to be a much narrower, more sort of evidence-driven topic than some we see. If you think about it, not only does this topic limit us to one specific field, energy policy, right, but also to one specific industry within that field, and being the nuclear industry. And then beyond that, if we're being honest, the main impact in most of the debates is already kind of decided for you. It's going to be climate change, right? If you look around at the real world debates on this topic, we're not talking about trying to sort of bring back or sort of push forward nuclear power because we think it's just nifty or because we really like the idea of, Homer Simpson's safety inspector or something. We're doing it because there is a strong argument that nuclear is our best way of producing carbon neutral or carbon-free or carbon emission-free power, and it's needed to fight climate change. So you have already narrowed the topic down from the whole world to a specific field, a specific industry, and in most cases a specific main impact. And as a result of that, you know what some of the most likely arguments are going to be, and you need to be prepared not just for the first level stuff, but really for the second level arguments that you can anticipate, and even maybe some of the third level arguments. So for example, we know that every single pro, unless they're brand new and this is their first tournament, is going to be saying that nuclear energy is key to preventing or mitigating climate change, right? So obviously any good con is going to have good, solid, well-written blocks for that. If you don't, then you're not going to be in a position to win. And the con is going to hit back, and they're going to say something like, it takes too long to develop nuclear plants, or renewables can do this better, or renewables can do this cheaper, or whatever. And at that level, honestly, the pros should be ready to hit back on those. In other words, it's kind of like a chess game where we kind of know what the opening moves are going to be to 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 moves out. And the more time you spend preparing for, I think, those likely arguments about climate change, about whether renewables can do it better, about nuclear waste, the better off you're going to be. If you go in with no blocks prepared or with very few blocks prepared, you're going to be kind of in a bad place. So just get those first few levels ready to go. And that's all I've got. You got anything else?
I think we're good to move on to the top of the case.
All right, we will talk in just a second about some definitions and some framework. Okay, so let's get started with some definitions and framework. I think overall the resolution is fairly straightforward, but I do see a little bit of room for some shenanigans and different interpretations, so it is worth, I think, going through definitions and framework in some depth. The first one is obviously going to be the United States. Now, there's a basic dichotomy here in terms of how you interpret the United States, and that is, are we talking about the United States federal government or some government entity, or are we just talking about the country as a whole, right? And that gives you a kind of an interesting sort of binary way of how you might conceive the resolution. If it's the United States federal government, right, and then we say increase, that is strongly implying some kind of action or policy by the United States federal government. Now, is it possible to run a case like that? Absolutely. Since the 1990s, the USFG has invested in nuclear power. You have the Energy Policy Act of 2005. You have various other things with tax credits. You have loan guarantees. The problem is, if you treat the United States as the United States federal government, those policies look an awful lot like plans. In fact, I don't even know how to couch them as anything other than plans. When you look at a summary of the Energy Policy Act, it's just a long list of very specific provisions. And if this were policy debate, fantastic. But in public forum, we're not supposed to be running plans. So
if I can jump in on
please.
that. So Brett and I talked yesterday about basically in this round, we can't fiat anything. So what we have to do is look at what's most likely to happen. So if you did want to have the USFG as the actor, you could argue that that's the most likely thing to happen, because if we look at the Energy Information Administration's outlook for 50 years, like their projection to 2070 of what we're going to do, there is no new nuclear being built. And the reason is the private sector isn't doing it. And we'll get more into that later. But if you want to run with the government as the actor, I mean, they're the only ones who would be doing this in the future. It's not the private sector.
And you can certainly find sources out there, and we will link to them, that basically say that without government intervention, the nuclear industry in the United States will not turn around. Like, the market's not doing it. Natural gas is so cheap. There's a public aversion to nuclear power to some extent. Without the government getting involved, they won't. And if you do that, then I think you will have to be ready to point to some things the government can do, and you'll have to do the usual sort of sidestep that we do in PF, where you say, oh, I'm not advocating for a plan, but if you want an example of what you might do,
right,
here are some things that could happen, right? But you can't say this will automatically happen by fiat, because that's a plan. But you can say, oh, there are many options we could have. But if you are going to go in that direction, you need to have a sense of exactly what you would have the government do. For me, for my money, right, frankly, the simplest way to come at it is to say, look, the resolution could say the United States federal government, but that's not what they wrote, right? They wrote the United States. And the natural interpretation of the United States is just the country as a whole. Couple that with the fact that in public forum we are prohibited by rule from running plans, right? And there's, we're not supposed to be doing that. And the natural interpretation, I think, would be to say, look, the resolution is just asking whether it would be good if the United States as a nation had more nuclear power, whatever that means, we'll talk about that in a second, as part of its energy production, system X number of years from now. So if I can show you, Judge, that 10, 20, whatever years from now, the United States would be a better place, the world would be a better place if we had more nuclear power, I don't have to get into the particulars of how it's going to happen. I can't get into the particulars of how it's going to happen because this is public forum debate. You can go either way, just know which way you're going. For my money, I think the second one's a little easier, but there certainly are plenty of proposals out there to try to kickstart the nuclear industry that you can look at if you want to.
Yeah, so that leads us to the second word in the resolution that's really important. Should, we use this word all the time. It basically means a good idea. I don't see that being something that's complicated, which leads us to increase. Now, in college debate, we tend to define words like this by giving a specific metric that you need to reach. And the reason for that is people like to be squirrely and get off into abuse arguments. But I think this is an important term. Now, if you just look at the Oxford English Dictionary, increase is make greater in size, amount, intensity, or degree. What I would argue for simplicity is that we simply need to look at, are we producing more megawatt hours or terawatt hours or any watt hours of nuclear energy? And the reason for this is if you use a percentage, since the amount of electricity demand that we have as a country is going up and down over time, like with energy efficiency and electrification of like cars and appliances, it just simply makes more sense. Well, more being absolute.
And
terms.
that's the basic dichotomy. When we say increase, do we mean that, as Alicia says, the absolute number of terawatt hours or megawatt hours goes up, or do we mean that the percentage share of the total amount of power created in the United States by nuclear power goes up? Right now, that's about 20%. So, one argument from a con could be you have to make some significant increase to that percent and show us how you're going to do it. The pro might say, no, I don't necessarily have to increase the percent. If the total energy production of the country is going up as a result of just the GDP growing and the population growing, and I just increase sort of linearly the amount of power that we're making in nuclear plants, then I've met my burden.
Yeah, if I were the pro, I would absolutely push back on the percentage issue. And the reason is we're seeing a lot of fossil fuel plants, like mainly coal plants, retiring, and that's going to affect the electricity mix. You see renewables coming on in record numbers. You see overall electricity demand is going down, but that's not to say it won't go up in the future as we once again electrify cars and appliances. So we don't have the tools to predict what the future mix will be. So we have to look at something concrete like megawatt hours.
And this goes to another greater challenge, and this is just kind of the history of the topic right now that the pro has, which is that if you look at the amount of production of nuclear power in the country, it spiked dramatically upward in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then it flatlined in the very end of the 1990s, right up until the present. And now what we're starting to see in terms of projections is that graph, it goes up and then it goes across, and then it's going to start going back down, because a lot of these plants, nuclear plants have life cycles, right? You don't build one and anticipate to have it around for 500 years. They have a life cycle, and many of them are scheduled to go offline. And in the status quo, and this is the challenge for the pro, in the status quo, right? If we do nothing, it's not going to stay at 20%. It's not going to even. It's not even going to stay at the number of megawatt hours. It's going to start going back down. So one of the additional burdens the pro has is, you have to, even if we take action and sort of bend the curve, arguably we would just be keeping the same amount. So there actually is an interesting point that you could argue. Some pros might even consider arguing and saying, look, if we were to change the curve, in other words, the expected amount of nuclear power is going to go down. If we make it go straight, in other words, if we maintain the status quo and keep the same number of megawatt hours, we are increasing it. Now, I don't know if I buy that.
I would absolutely fight back on that as the neg. That is abusive.
Yeah, so, but I guess what it means is you have to be aware that, whatever course you take on increase, whether it's percentage, whether it's absolute hours or anything like that, you've got to be looking at evidence that shows that it needs to go up, which means that you don't need, and what the takeaway on this is, you don't need to just be citing evidence that says nuclear is good or nuclear is, is helpful in some generic way. You need to either be citing evidence that says we need nuclear power to accomplish a goal like climate change mitigation, and that goal requires more of it, right? Or evidence that says that nuclear power is just generically better and you really can't get too much of it. Like there's no air pollution. Like the more nuclear power you have, the less air pollution, the fewer air pollution deaths. So as the pro, you really want to be citing evidence that doesn't just say it's good, because if you just say it's good, that means the con can come back and say, well, yes, but is it so good that we need to, bend the curve this much? You need to be saying we've got to meet a goal, right? And here's how much we have to meet the goal.
And one more thing before we move into contentions, we need to think about a weighing mechanism, because there is so much on this. I mean, you've got the health effects, the environmental effects, you have the economic effects. All of these different factors are coming in, and they don't necessarily lend themselves to direct comparison. So you need to give your judge a weighing mechanism for this one. And one that might be good, especially on the affirmative, is a cost-benefit analysis, because even though nuclear is expensive, I mean, climate change already, if you count up the health effects, all the disaster effects, you see that it's so much more costly.
We don't tend to explicitly state weighing mechanisms like they do in Lincoln Douglas with values and criteria, but I do think this is something where there are so many factors at play: cost, the environment, disasters, general health concerns, safety, that yes, having a clear framework for the judge to look at and say, okay, if we end up saving more lives, even if it costs a little bit more, that's the framework we should be looking to. I do think
lives would be a good weighing mechanism, honestly.
Right. So I do think for both sides, sort of saying, look, there's a million things you could look at on this, but here's what you ought to prioritize at some point in the debate is not a bad idea. The other thing, I guess the other big term is commercial energy production. It's important not to get confused on this, because you can get a little confused. If you go out and just research commercial energy definitions, you might find definitions for commercial energy consumption, and you'll actually be misled if you go with those, because commercial energy consumption looks at who is buying the energy. So to be a commercial energy consumption, it has to be like a commercial buyer, like a store, and that gets differentiated from like residential buyers and industrial buyers. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about commercial energy production, and what that is, there's a good card from I think you pronounce it Car in Car 2019. They have a good card on this, and it basically says commercial energy is just energy that the public can buy for a set price. It's the energy produced by a power plant, right, that you can run through the grid and buy for a certain rate on your meter. The only thing that really wouldn't be that, and I know Alicia has a kind of an interesting take on this, but the only thing that wouldn't be that would be like things that are not for sale.
So like nuclear medicine is what they're trying to exclude, or they're trying to exclude nuclear power subs.
Or like nuclear power, or like forms of power that are not commercial. Like in the developing world, sometimes farmers cut down logs and burn the logs, or burn dung or whatever like that.
We actually use biomass in the U.S., so I wouldn't use that example, but we don't burn dung here.
But everything else, right, everything else at least arguably would be commercial energy production. So don't get hung up on that. It's pretty much everything, unless...
If you run it straightforward, it shouldn't be a big issue, but I found a way that you could run it a little bit more interestingly on the negative. So if you just Google the definition of commercial, it is intended to make a profit. So what you could argue here is that because the private sector is not moving to build nuclear plants, in fact, they are averse to building more nuclear plants, you could argue that we shouldn't be doing it for commercial energy production, but we should have the government build nuclear. Basically make an argument about the actor. And the reasons for this, you could give a lot of good examples, but one, there is no profit incentive there. So the only actor who will be building nuclear is the government. But second of all, you could argue that since the government is the actor, the permitting process would be quicker. You would have less issues with regulatory uncertainty. If the government were the actor, a lot of these obstacles would go away.
There are plenty of proposals out there, for example, like ideas that the Department of Defense should be in the business of building and regulating and running and promoting nuclear plants. There are ideas about how the government needs to heavily subsidize these things. And the reason for it is because right now, with the cheapness of gas and coal, right, it is very difficult to make a profit building a new and constructing and running a new nuclear plant. So I don't know that I would run this, but it is far from crazy, right?
It's not unprecedented.
It's not
Back
nuts.
in the 1960s, the government owned and operated a large percentage of our nuclear plants. I mean, the Tennessee Valley Authority, I mean, certainly their first charge is preventing flooding in the Tennessee Valley, but their second charge is providing low-cost energy to rural areas. So they built tons of nuclear plants back in the 1960s, and that is a government organization.
So bottom line is, if you want a straightforward definition, it's just basically all energy you can buy. The car and car card from 2019 that we'll link to. But do be aware, if commercial means for profit, then there is an interesting off-case, counter-plan-y kind of sounding thing that some cons might run. So yeah, that is a little bit of a nuance. But overall, what I would say is, we didn't have to spend a whole lot of time on the framing here, because I do feel like, again, it is a fairly straightforward topic that's frankly kind of merciful after UBI last month, when the pro had to just do contortions and backflips to try to make their advocacy viable. So that's nice. And so with that, yes, moving on to pro arguments, and then later on to the con arguments. All right, so on the pro side, I've looked around kind of online at what some people are saying about this topic, and I've noticed that some people tend to think that there's like a pro side bias to it because of what we're going to talk about in a second, which is climate change. Honestly, I do not see that. I think this is one of the most balanced topics out there. It's a deep topic that you can take arguments 2 or 3 levels deep on. I think Alicia has been a big help because she has more knowledge about it than I do, obviously, and has kind of explained some things to me. But nonetheless, I mean, my advice, honestly, on this, somebody in the comments on the last video was like, should we go con every time on UBI? The answer was yes. On this one, my advice is speak last, right? And when you're flipping, there is good ground on the pro and there's good ground on the con, and good teams are going to be able to win on either side. So whatever your preferred speaking order, I know most people it's last. That's what I would go with. I think they are well balanced. But with that out of the way, before we get into the vast panoply of arguments on the pro and the con, I think we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The reason we're talking about climate change in the first place is not because we just like the cool atomic era aesthetics and vibes and things like that. It's because of climate change, right? And the basic argument that every pro is going to run front and center, or at least the vast majority, is that that nuclear energy, and more of it, is essential to mitigating climate change. Now, before we get into the particulars, we obviously have to note that sort of the inherency problem, right? What we would call inherency if we were like in policy debate, which is climate change is bad. Now, depending on where you're debating, this may be almost taken as a given. You may be able to read 2 sentences off a card and nobody decides to debate it. In other places, it may be more contentious, but you do need at some point in the case to spend a little time, not a full minute, not even 30 seconds, but a little time establishing climate change is bad and we need to do something about it. So I have a little block that I will post this to the slides, and so that you can just use it and steal it if you want. But I have a little block we did back in 2016 on the LD topic on nuclear energy, and it just goes like this. The World Health Organization estimated in June 2016 between 2030 and 2050, climate change will cause 250,000 deaths per year due to lack of sufficient food and water erosion in coastal regions. Further, a 2015 UC Berkeley study found that unchecked climate change will stop global economic growth and shrink the global economy by 23%, which is the equivalent of destroying the entire United States economy. Right? So something quick like that says deaths and economics, whatever you want to say. But yes, you do need to get out there and say, hey, climate change is bad. Probably just a couple of sentences. Once you do that, I do think you also need to be prepared before we get into the specifically nuclear stuff to make the argument that climate change is solvable. One stock response on any climate change impact on any resolution, this one or any other one, is that it's too late to do anything about it, right? Climate change is going to happen. We can't stop it. There are good cards on this that we will link to. So another block that we had back in 2016, and I'll try to update this, maybe put some new sources in the links, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which we may talk about more later, confirmed in November 2015 that we can still avoid all or most of the worst harms if we act now, so that carbon emissions peak in the 2020s and then drop dramatically. IPCC also explained in a November 2014 report that avoiding catastrophic climate change requires a complete phase out of fossil fuels, right? So we'll put the links to those things, but you may not necessarily have to read that argument in your case, but you need to be ready to hit back if somebody runs a general argument like you just can't solve this, right? And so then you sort of jump into this, to the basic idea, which is, and the core of the whole thing, which is that nuclear energy is the biggest, most reliable single source of carbon emission-free energy in the world. And if you want a card on that, there's plenty of them out there. There's this one we have from Hejazi 2017, and it just is a nice little block. It says, nuclear power emits virtually no air pollution or greenhouse gases. The complete nuclear power chain from uranium mining to waste disposal, including the reactor and facility, releases only about 2.6 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. It compares that to what you see at other types of plants, and it just is a nice card that goes from the beginning of the life cycle and the mining all the way to the waste disposal, and it says we are not producing significant amounts of CO2. So that's nice to have so that nobody can try to get squirrely and say, well, what about the mining process? No, that's all covered. It's very low emissions, right? Now, once you establish, that nuclear power is essentially emission-free or close to emission-free, the next thing you need to do is try to link it as specifically and precisely as you can to benefits. If you're just kind of pointing to an amorphous cloud of less climate change, well, that's good, right? We all know climate change is bad, but it's better if you can link to specific harms from climate change and air pollution and things like that, and actually point to numbers. And luckily, there are some good sources on this. So, for example, Korecha and Hansen 2013 found, quote, nuclear power has prevented an average of 1.84 million air pollution-related deaths and 64 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that would have resulted from fossil fuel burning. They find, quote, that nuclear power could additionally prevent an average of 420,000 to 7.04 million deaths and 80 to 240 gigatons of emissions due to fossil fuels by mid-century. So these are hardcore numbers. These are people saying if you go nuclear, you are going to be saving millions of lives per year. You are going to be reducing carbon emissions by massive amounts. Now, granted, this is global as opposed to just the United States, but the argument would be, in this resolution, we only have the United States is the only thing we can control, so we've got to do what we can here. Another source on this that kind of links directly to measurable stuff is the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. They have this very frequently quoted statistic, which would be good for lay judges, I think, that current nuclear power usage as opposed to fossil fuels, and Alicia's going to talk about this in a second, which is the trade-off with fossil fuels, right? Using nuclear as opposed to fossil fuels is the equivalent of taking 400 million cars off the road, right? So every year we have like 400 million fewer carbon-emitting cars on the road, or the equivalent of that, it's 200 billion tons of CO2 every year. So if you need a statistic that will resonate with, a community judge or a parent judge or something, 400 million fewer cars on the road, these are good specific statistics that talk specifically about nuclear power linking to climate change and linking to deaths. So with that, we have to talk about the basic choice you have to make.
Right, so now that we've established that climate change is bad, you really have two options. One, you can throw all of your money and all of your energy behind nuclear, or you can throw it behind renewables. And obviously, as the affirmative, you are going to be putting that energy behind nuclear. So I'm going to give you a couple reasons why renewables alone are not enough to solve the problem, at least in time. So the first one, deferring to the experts, we look at the IPCC in November of 2018. They looked at 85 different scenarios to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C by 2100. And that's our ambitious goal. 2 degrees C is kind of our backup goal. But in all 85 of those scenarios, they found that the median output from nuclear plants more than doubled between 2020 and 2050. So the IPCC is assuming that nuclear output needs to grow. And we see that a lot of other countries are getting the memo and building nuclear plants, even though it's not as much in Europe, but worldwide we're seeing that nuclear is really catching on. And the United States is going in the opposite direction. And as Brett likes to tell us to do, you defer to the experts in the rounds, and the IPCC is very well established.
Real quick, one phrase I love to use in rounds, and some of my best debaters, you've used used it, Mia Robertson has used it, somebody we've had on the channel before, is at the end of the day, Judge, you can either listen to the teenagers or the college students here, or you can listen to the people who do this for a living and actually make the policy. I think the IPCC source is extremely good because what they're doing is this is the most authoritative source arguably in the world.
On climate change.
And they are gaming out all the possible worlds in which we avoid catastrophic climate change, and they're telling you that in every single scenario that they can come up with, right, nuclear power has to go up. One other note that I have, this is layperson talking here, right, the 1.5 degree Celsius increase goal, make sure you're familiar with that. Like if you're going to run something around meeting that goal, right, nuclear energy is necessary to meet the 1.5 degree increase goal that the IPCC has set. Know what that is, right? Take the time to be able to explain, here's what happens if we don't meet 1.5 degrees,
right? And just a good stat for you that I have on that, I don't have the source because I used it in a presentation earlier this week, but I will get it for the links. 40 billion people will be exposed to drought every year. An additional 40 billion people will be exposed to drought every year if we go past that 1.5 degrees C. And a lot of that will be in the global south. So basically people who are already disadvantaged will be struggling with food insecurity and water insecurity even more. That's a really good stat to have about just how bad more than 1.5 degrees C warming would be.
It's important to remember that all of these assumptions from the IPCC and everything that we're talking about on climate change assumes that the absence of nuclear, the void from not enough nuclear, will be filled primarily by fossil fuels. Luckily, that's a very safe assumption, right? That's an assumption that has evidence to back it up. You need to be ready with that, right? Because remember, less nuclear is not just like we're not going to have as much power. It's we're going to have coal and gas fill that up. And there's some pretty good sources on that. For example, Catherine Tweed from 2016 takes data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and she puts together this very nice chart that will pop up on the screen that shows like before and after, like when states have taken nuclear plants offline, what was the composition of their power generation, how much of it was coal and how much of it was gas. And in most cases, it either stays very close or increases slightly, or it increases a lot, right? Mm-hmm. So what it shows is that a big portion of this gap that you leave behind when nuclear goes down is in fact filled by fossil fuels. And if you want to put like a specific statistic number on that, there's some congressional testimony from Dr. Rachel Cletus, who's the policy director for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it says if we allow nuclear plants to go offline, what we're going to see is about a 6% increase in CO2 when what we need to be doing is going down towards zero CO2. So it's not only going to be incompatible with the amount of reduction we need, it's going to be actually increasing if we lose nuclear plants, right?
Yeah, so going back to that point we were talking about, I mean, the authoritative figure on climate change says we have to have more nuclear, not less. But going further from that, to have 100% renewable, because the wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining, we need cheap and abundant energy storage. But the fact is, according to Bloomberg New Energy Forecasting, storage is currently $156 per kilowatt hour, which, I mean, you probably don't have much of a frame of reference on that. But for comparison, energy right now is currently about $70 per kilowatt hour, and that's just the storage. Like, that's not even the energy that is being stored in the storage, so that's a lot of money.
So just to back up real quick for lay people here, what we're talking about in this case is the fact that we know, right, this is what we talked about earlier, we know how the chess game is going to play out. We know what the most likely response is. Many cons are going to come in and say, yeah, we know we don't need to have as much fossil fuel, but it would be better to do it as renewables. Now, while talking a little bit about like the validity of that, right, as a matter of debate theory, but the core argument that the pro's going to have to be ready to make is we are not ready to do that. That is not commercially viable, right?
Yeah, so just to put a number on where storage prices need to be, this comes from Ziegler et al. Writing in Joule in August of 2019. Joule is an academic journal highly regarded in the energy industry, and what they find is for us to be 100% renewable all the time, we would need energy storage to be less than $20 per kilowatt hour. So that is, we would need energy storage prices to drop by like 90%. I can do the actual math for you on that, but we would need it to drop from $156 per kilowatt hour to $20 per kilowatt hour or less.
Yeah. So basically, if you're on the pro and you are not ready to hit back on the cons argument that a renewable world is better than a nuclear world, then you're going to have a bad time, right? It's not going to go well for you. So you need to be ready on that.
Right, and something that I don't have the numbers right in front of me for on that topic is what it would look like to have that much energy storage. I mean, you may know that it requires lithium and cobalt and other rare earth minerals that we largely get from China. And we don't have the production capacity for all of that. We certainly don't have access to the minerals. So if you really want to put a lot of your cards behind that argument, talk about, dependency on China and how we just don't have the supply chain for energy storage at that scale. One other point is land use. I mean, we know the United States is pretty big, but we also know that people tend to locate in about 10 to 15 different cities, like more so than others. And if you look at the land use for nuclear versus wind and solar, nuclear uses 12.71 acres per megawatt produced. I mean, that sounds like a lot, but solar uses 43.5 acres of land per megawatt produced, and wind uses 70.64 acres per megawatt produced. So unless we have just tremendously long transmission lines just yeeting this energy from the middle of the country to these big cities, you're going to see that we're going to run out of space near population centers, which is why nuclear is way better.
And as Donald Trump said, we've got these windmills. They're like all different colors, and they're ugly, and they're
killing birds and causing cancer.
Killing birds, causing cancer. I mean, come on, folks. I mean, we don't.
I actually read a study that they really are contributing to the decline of our local bat population. So if you want to lay on the pathos,
ruining the view from your home on the Cape up in Massachusetts,
reduces property values.
Absolutely.
I mean, wind and solar. I mean, they're terrible.
Right.
So this should be a whole contention for you because, I mean, frankly, no high school student is going to have this unless they watch our video. So the contention I have for you is uprating existing plants is a rapid and affordable solution. So an uprate is when you take an existing power plant and you do some modifications so that it can produce more energy, so it becomes more efficient. So the source I have for you is from Power Magazine in November 2019. It talks about how they did an extended power uprate at the Browns Ferry nuclear plant, which for those of you in Mississippi is just right across the state line in Decatur, Alabama.
Can I do a real quick translation, just so you know? Okay, layperson translation here. What we are doing is, we're going through the multiple levels of the chess game. We know the con is going to say this is expensive and it takes a long time, right? That's going to be one of their big blocks. We can't do nuclear because it's expensive and it takes a long time. And what Alicia is saying is, oh, good news, you don't have to build new nuclear plants in order to increase nuclear capacity. You can do something called uprating, which is expanding the existing capacity of existing plants. Back to you.
Yeah, so going back to that Power Magazine article I was talking about, what they talked about is how we really haven't built too many nuclear plants since 1986, and the reason for that was 3 Mile Island kind of scared people to death, and because of all the new safety features, a new plant is super expensive. So what we have done instead, between 1996 and today, we have added 7 gigawatts, or 7,000 megawatts of nuclear generating capacity through these uprates. Now, these have happened at 135 separate nuclear reactors, and depending on what you do, you can increase the capacity between 1% and 20%. So you would be increasing the capacity from existing plants. Now, just to look at how many plants are capable of doing this, I looked at the Energy Information Administration, and we have 96 reactors currently in operation. But only 34 of those have undergone extensive uprates. So just doing the quick math, that's 62 plants that have not had their capacity increased, or 2/3. So we could increase the capacity of 2/3 of our reactors between 10 and 20% if we did an extended power uprate on them.
Here's the good thing about this. You might or might not include this as a contention. I'm almost inclined to have this in your back pocket as a block, right? A really good block, right? Let them take the bait, right? Let the con take the bait and spend a bunch of time talking about, oh, this costs so much, oh, this takes so long, and then you get up in, either the second constructive or in the summary, whatever, right? And you stand up and say, oh, no, actually, that's not what we can't do a plan, but what we can tell you is there's actually a lot more uprating going on than new plant construction, right? In the actual status quo, the most likely thing to happen is to have a plant uprated, and the uprate will increase the capacity, and it's cheaper, and it's faster. So all this stuff they talk about building new plants, who said anything about building new plants?
Yeah, that's actually a great strategy. But I mean, just to put it in context, we have built 2 new plants since 1996, and both have been incredibly over budget and incredibly past their set timelines. Whereas these uprates, I mean, 135 since 1996, they're very common, and the reason they do it is because it's a lot cheaper than a new plant. So for instance, to increase the capacity at the Browns Ferry plant that I was talking to you about, it'll increase the capacity 20% and only cost $475 million, whereas your nuclear plants that are brand new, you're looking at billions of dollars.
Billions with a B.
Billions with a B, as opposed to millions with an M.
Right. You want to keep going? Because
I do have one more contention,
Go for
but if you want to talk about advanced nuclear, I can just
No,
piggyback
I was
on
actually
what
going
you
to talk
have.
about deaths.
Oh, talk about deaths, and then we'll go back to
We
my
talk a
fourth
lot
contention.
about these deep subjects when we go on these 6-hour drives.
We
about
really
like
do.
whether our universe is the only universe that exists.
Are we living in a simulation?
If you have thoughts about whether we're living in a simulation, please put them in the comments below, because we'll definitely talk about them on a trip. No, I just want to talk about some just general statistics about how nuclear energy actually reduces deaths. I mean, these are like, this is getting into fairly deep stuff, although it's certainly not too deep to run, but this is just like really easy access stuff about how nuclear energy reduces deaths. The first one is that nuclear energy is by far the lowest death toll per unit of energy production, like death rates per terawatt hour. This was summed up by Marcandia, I think it's Marcandia and Wilkinson. I got Wilkinson.
You just got to
right.
sound confident.
I really messed this up bad. I'm so sorry, guys. I work hard on pronunciation, but like Marcandia and Wilkinson, 2007, and Hannah Ritchie, I think, cites it in 2020 if you want a more current, reference to the source. But you can look at the chart we have here. We're going to pop it up on the screen. You can see that like the death rate per terawatt hour for brown coal from like air pollution and accidents and all these things is like 32.72, right? Whereas the death rate for nuclear is 0.07, a fraction of the next lowest one, which is gas at 2.82. So this is going to be a great answer to a lot of the many different arguments that you see from the con. The con's going to talk about disasters. They're going to talk about just general pollution. They're going to talk about nuclear waste. Your answer is that has all been answered. We factored all of those things into a death rate per terawatt hour, and it turns out nuclear is the safest. And there's an interesting analogy, which is like, nuclear disasters are kind of like plane crashes, right? They're big, they're spectacular. We make TV series out of them with like Chernobyl and things like that, right? But what's not spectacular is people dying every day as a result of air pollution. It's kind of like the difference between a plane crash and the thousands of car crashes that we have every day. Some people don't like to go on airplanes because a plane crash is terrifying, but the reality is you're much safer on an airplane. Same thing here. You're actually much safer, right, with nuclear overall in terms of death rates if you believe the evidence from Marcandia and Wilkinson. So that's a good statistic. The second one is to look, just stepping a little bit outside of just climate change, but still staying in the environmental sphere, is to look at air pollution, because remember, not only are we not releasing greenhouse gases from these nuclear plants, we're not releasing really any significant amount of air pollution. Those big smokestack things, it's actually not smoke. I think it's like water vapor, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, so you're not polluting the air, right? And so Ritchie and Roser, 2019, note that outdoor air pollution is linked to an amazing 3.4 million deaths per year. People don't think about that. That's not climate change, that's just outdoor air pollution in place. Now, not all in the United States, of course, but you can extrapolate to the United States, right? But nuclear plants emit basically none. So Korecha and Hansen, 2013, as we noted a little bit earlier, said nuclear power has prevented an average of 1.84 million air pollution-related deaths per year. Well, that's amazing, right? And we want to continue that. So that's a little bit of a departure from climate change, but still in the environmental sphere. So the last point for me on the pro will be if you want to change up the pace a little bit, right? So you have been talking about climate change, you've been talking about deaths, you've been talking about air pollution, those kind of things. You want to have something in that third contention that forces the con to defend something different, right? Makes them use time on something else. Even if you don't think it's the strongest contention, I'm a big fan of have something else in there that makes them take time on it, right? So a couple of options. The one that I like the best is talking a little bit about national security. I do not think this is a by itself round-winning argument, but it's so different, like it's useful. And so the basic argument here is that the United States used to have global dominance in the nuclear industry, right? In the nuclear field in terms of technology. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we as the United States were sharing our nuclear technology with countries all over the world. And because we were sharing all this technology that they didn't have, we got to basically force them to sign on to our non-proliferation and security protocols. Keep your nuclear fissile materials safe, keep them from proliferating, don't give them to rogue regimes. It didn't always work, but I think most experts would agree that it did make the world a safer place. If you want to read this whole argument, it comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the basic thing they say is that the longer we let nuclear decline, the more we cede dominance to China, right? And China is not nearly as concerned about safety, they're not nearly as concerned about non-proliferation, they're not nearly as concerned about preventing this stuff from being stolen. And the longer we let this go, the less influence we have until the point where we have very little or no influence. This hurts the United States in two ways. Number one, it undermines our global leadership, right? Our soft power, our ability to sort of exert influence around the world. But number two, it makes the world more dangerous for like loose nukes, right? Like loose nuclear material, like getting stolen, getting taken by terrorists and things like that. But anyway, the CSIS study on this is pretty good. I would not make this the centerpiece of my case, but if you want to get sort of a change up at the end, I think it's a good idea. Really quickly, one argument that I've heard talked about that I don't think is super strong is the argument for jobs and economic stimulus, right?
I have a block on that, actually.
Well, fantastic. I mean, I'll give you my basic thoughts, and then she can give you actual evidence. But the basic idea is, I've seen some people saying, well, if we increase nuclear power generation, we'll be building plants, and there's lots of people that work on building these plants. And my response, just on an intuitive level, is fair enough, but like we're going to be creating power generation capacity one way or another, no matter how we do it, whether we do it through gas or coal or solar or hydro or whatever, right? We're going to be building dams and windmills and whatever we use, right? So there's no unique advantage to having them work on nuclear plants as opposed to hydro plants or as opposed to wind turbines or things like that, unless they can specifically show that it's more labor intensive, in which case it would just probably be more costly. So I just don't think that jobs is a real unique advantage. But
yeah, so the response to this comes from the Department of Energy's annual employment report. And what it does is it looks at who's working in the energy industry and where. And as of 2018, the most recent year we have data for, more than 4 times as many people were employed in solar as in nuclear. And that involves construction, that involves running the plant, that involves all stages. And the reason is we build solar everywhere, all over the country. It's a very dispersed resource. So you need people who are building the metallic racks for it. You need welders, you need installers, you need people to do the surveying, and it's all over the place, whereas nuclear plants are very centralized.
So if anybody wanted to run kind of an economic stimulus jobs creator kind of thing, it might very well be the con, right, as opposed to the pro. So
absolutely.
So with that, we will move on to give the con its due and look at some con arguments in just 1 second.
Okay, so with that, we're going to move into some of the negative arguments. Like Brett said at the beginning, this is a relatively balanced case, but on the con, you're basically going to be taking the position that nuclear is bad. And I've got 5 key ways that that's really the case. So I'm going to be covering cost, time frame, what we actually need in our system, which is flexibility, not baseload like nuclear, and then safety in the environment, some of the obvious ones. So just probably the most obvious one is the cost. This comes from Lazard in November 2019. They're a highly respected industrial consulting firm. And what they do is they look at the cost of building new generation technologies on a per megawatt hour basis. So basically this is normalized for the amount of energy that each type of capacity produces, and according to their analysis, new nuclear costs between $118 and $192 per megawatt hour, which is a lot. Compare that to wind and solar that range between $32 and $44 per megawatt hour for solar and $28 to $54 per megawatt hour for wind. Bottom line here is that nuclear is on average 308% more expensive than new solar and 278% more expensive than new wind. And I think you had some more on the cost argument to contribute.
It's very similar. I mean, this is Climate Nexus 2019, but it's talking about how it's not just, it's similar numbers to what you're talking about. They might be a little bit different, and we'll post both of them. But like the basic idea, it's not just fossil fuels that are cheaper, right? I mean, that's the narrative you have to keep in mind. The renewables industry has taken off. It's not in its infancy anymore. It's not something that has to be coddled along with subsidies in order to be viable. It's something where you can make these things more cheaply. So the idea that we're not going to be able to have, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, the idea that we're not going to be able to have renewables do this work is becoming less and less viable every single day as renewables get cheaper and more reliable and more entrenched, right?
Yeah, so the second big contention on this, I think this is the piece that wins the case for you, and it's that the timeline for nuclear just doesn't work with our climate crisis. So if you look first at Climate Action Tracker from 2020, they look at where we need to be to meet our 1.5 degrees C goal and our 2 degrees C goal. And in both cases, we need to see emissions start dropping this year. The problem is nuclear power plants take a hot minute to build. So this comes from the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2019. Like it's raw data. I pulled it from Table 8. We look at, since 1986, the median time to build a nuclear power plant worldwide has been roughly 7.5 years, or 88.84 months. Okay, that's worldwide. In the United States, over the same time period, it's been roughly 13.2 years. So if we need to reduce emissions today, we can't wait 13.2 years to build a nuclear plant. Contrast that with wind and solar, that from the time that you pour the first concrete or start saying, hey, I'm going to build a solar farm or a wind plant, we see that it's about maximum 2 or 3 years. In many cases, it can be done in under a year. So they are much more compatible with our time frame, and we'll link all of those sources for you.
If I'm the pro, the way I respond to that, and I think there's a response to the response is why I'm saying it, the pro might say something like, well, you know, obviously, once we decide to really get on the horse and start fighting climate change, we could probably make nuclear plants happen faster than we currently do. And that's probably true. But here's the thing, if we had that sense of urgency, we could probably make, you know, wind turbines and dams and hydroelectric, all those things happen faster too. So in a world where we're more urgent about it, we would presumably be more urgent about anything. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, no matter at whatever level of urgency you have about climate change, nuclear is a lot slower, right?
Yeah, and the response I'd have to what he just said for nuclear is there are supply bottlenecks worldwide that prevent you from going too much faster. You might be able to go 6 years, 5 years, but the fact is you need steel containment vessels that are only produced in Japan, and they make 4 per year.
Yeah.
But Saudi Arabia is currently building nuclear reactors. I think Vietnam is building some. So we're going to have to wait in a long line or start building these ourselves to speed up that process much more.
It's not just a matter
of safety issue.
It's not just a matter of like permits taking a long. It's not like government approvals. That's part of it, but a big part of it is actual bottlenecks. And so again, this is what we're talking about with the multiple levels of the chess game and kind of predicting what you're going to see. You know, how speed and time frame is going to be an issue, and being able to show that there's no good way to speed these things up is going to be important. So yeah.
Yeah, so the next big point, you're going to hear someone who thinks they know more than they don't walk into your round and be like, nuclear provides baseload power, and we need baseload power that's always on.
What is baseload power?
Baseload power is power that is always being produced. So fossil fuel plants run 24 hours a day, typically. Nuclear plants run 24 hours a day, and the only time that they're not producing, in the case of things like coal and nuclear, is if they are down for whatever reason. Nuclear for refueling, coal would be probably for maintenance.
But by contrast, renewables
are available when they're available.
Right.
If the sun's shining, you get solar. If it's not, well, you're sad. And same with wind.
So like last night, she was explaining this to me up at a chalkboard, and I'm going to explain it like a person who doesn't understand it. But like the power demands, right, are going to go like really high in the morning when you're out there with like your hair dryer and stuff getting ready. They're going to go down through the middle of the day when you're at work and come back up in the evening when you get home and like watch Netflix and play Fallout like I do, right? Solar power, however, goes the opposite direction. It's low in the morning and gets high in the middle of the day, and then it goes goes back down. And sort of like what she talked about earlier, which is, I guess this is getting into the cost of how you store that energy, but the basic idea is there's a difference between base load and the fluctuating power we get from renewables. So you need to understand that concept.
Yeah, and if you're looking to be a smart aleck on storage, you can tell people we don't need lithium-ion batteries because we've had pumped hydro for years, and that's one of the cheapest forms of energy storage we have. We would just have to resolve to build it. But I mean, if we're going to be playing in debate land where, you know, we're not necessarily looking at what is happening, but what could happen, what would be reasonable, that's absolutely a form of storage you can talk about. So going back to the source I had, this is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in 2016. What they say is that all power systems have some inherent level of flexibility because our power system has to constantly balance demand, like Brett was just talking about, with supply, because otherwise you have the whole system trips and you are without power. So we have to have some level of flexibility, but what we see is with wind and solar, because they're only available when they're available, we need more flexibility than ever. So we need resources that can increase their production or increase their discharge in the case of storage and ramp it down really quick. We need something that's very responsive. So looking at what nuclear does, can nuclear fit that bill? And the answer is no. This comes from Mark Jacobson from Stanford in 2020. Unfortunately, it comes from his Twitter, but I mean, he's a PhD physicist at Stanford.
He does have some good published stuff. I'm actually looking at it right now, but I'm sure what he said on Twitter was much better like soundbite stuff.
Yeah, so it says, even in France, the country where nuclear is most prevalent, nuclear ramps at a maximum rate of 1 to 5% per minute. And basically this means you can't use it as a flexible resource in tandem with wind and solar. And in fact, as Brett told me in a tournament last weekend, France spends $25 billion per year backing up their nuclear with natural gas and other resources. So clearly, nuclear will not do the job. Nuclear doesn't provide what we need right now. In fact, we use natural gas for most of our flexibility, but if we're trying to get rid of natural gas, we have to have something that can replace it, and the only option really available to us is storage.
So for me, I think that, you know, the core of the Khan case has to be giving some viable alternative to nuclear power as a means of fighting climate change, right? This is the sort of second line argument that you have to have ready. That's kind of an inherent part of the Khan case. And Alicia's been talking about some components about that, and she's going to add some more in a minute. But I just want to take a second to sort of make it clear that there are viable arguments that we can go all renewable. In other words, if we want to have a system that has reliable power, that is always available, that is always sufficient, and is essentially carbon neutral or carbon free, right? It doesn't have to be nuclear power. We have other better options. And so citing the same person that she was citing, this is Mark Jacobson of Stanford, this is back in 2015, with a bunch of other authors. He publishes a very nice study of a lot of different sources of literature and a lot of different analyses of different, you know, forms of renewable resources, and he finds that it is absolutely plausible to have an all-renewable system that meets all of the U.S.'s power generation needs. He's looking, to be fair, at a time frame from about 2050 to 2055, but realistically, you know, there's nothing in the resolution that says that we have to solve all these problems overnight. Any kind of overhaul of the United States power system is going to take time, but what he does talk about is how the idea that an all-renewable system can work. There's another, you know, source on this, a guy named Amory Lovins, who's the chief scientist at the Rocky Mountain Institute, also back in 2015. He basically tries to debunk the idea that you can't have an all-renewable system. He says, quote, nuclear advocates fall back on two mystical claims, that baseload power stations are needed to keep the lights on, and that renewables can't grow much without cheap bulk storage of electricity. These linked claims lack foundation. More than 15 sophisticated studies show that largely or wholly renewable electricity can sustain reliability and improve resilience at reasonable cost with little or no bulk storage. So you're definitely going to want to have authoritative, yes, you want to explain the details, right? You want to understand how that works, but you want to have folks in the Stanford study and the Amory Lovins article, you know, that are saying in very simple terms, we could do this through renewables. Nuclear is not our only option. You would only do nuclear if it were your only option, and it's not. We have a better choice. Now, I want to be fair here because I think there is a pro response to this, which is that it is not at all clear that the Khan gets to sort of fiat a world where we go renewable, right? This goes to something in debate called counterplan theory. And if you haven't been around for a long time, like decades, it may be something that you don't think about. But like a long time ago in debate, there was a big sort of argument among debate coaches about whether the negative or the con could even run a counterplan. The idea being that like you have two choices, Judge. You can either do the thing the resolution says or you can not do it, but you don't get to make up a second thing and then do that, right? Now, this line of reasoning about debate was largely thrown away in policy. It's clear in policy debate that people run counterplans. It's basically been abandoned in LD. But in public forum debate, where we're specifically told we can't run counterplans, it may have some validity. And the argument would be, Judge, if you vote for the con, you don't get to magically create a world where we're going all renewable. You're going to get like whatever we would naturally get in the real world if we did not have nuclear energy. And what the evidence shows is that you're going to get a very significant amount of fossil fuel. Now, you're not going to get all fossil fuel, right? But for the most part, as we talked about earlier, when you get rid of nuclear energy, you're going to see an increase in fossil fuel usage, right?
Yeah, if you want the actual numbers on that, the Energy Information Administration does an annual energy outlook. So that's just for this year, but looking forward as far as 2050. And what they say is that they're expecting nearly equal capacity additions from renewables and natural gas. So basically, if we don't build nuclear, we're going to need more energy. And by their projections, based on market conditions and all the different factors, half of it will be natural gas, half will be renewables. So at best, you get half of what you want.
But I do think it is important, however you come down on that, I do think it is important for the con to take a stab and saying, look, we are not in the business of simply saying we're going to throw up our hands and just have, coal and gas, doing the job for us forever, that there are other viable options, and that these arguments about how the basic argument on nuclear is that, as Alicia said, it's always on, it's always there, unlike the fluctuations you see with wind and solar and things like that. And these studies say basically, no, renewables can handle that. There are pieces within the sort of the set of renewable options that can work there, and I think you need to have those. So.
Yeah, so the next contention that we go to is one that's really good for pathos. I think that's a good thing to use in public forum, is the safety concerns. Most people have some kind of inherent fear about nuclear because we've been around for the news stories on Chernobyl. We've been around for stories about 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. I mean, I don't know how old y'all were, but I was in 2011, 13 years old. So I remember Fukushima pretty vividly. So just to put some numbers on what has happened worldwide, like in terms of nuclear incidents, this comes from, let me look at the university. It's in the journal Ethics, Policy, and Environment, and this is from the University of Notre Dame. What they do is from the beginning of nuclear energy worldwide to 2011, they look at all of the full or partial meltdowns that have happened. And according to this analysis, there were 26 full or partial meltdowns worldwide during that time period. And this excludes a lot of really serious accidents we've had here in the US. For instance, a criticality catastrophe that happened in Rhode Island in 1964, a fire that happened at a reactor near Chicago, a loss of cooling incident that happened in upstate New York, explosions in Nebraska and Connecticut. I mean, we could go on and on about nuclear disasters here in the United States, and I would maybe cherry pick those carefully to really lay on the fear about it, to be honest. But a statistic that you might like to use just for fun in your case, Leonardo DiCaprio on his environmental website puts in perspective that approximately 1.5% of all nuclear reactors that have ever operated worldwide have fully or partially melted down. So I guess what I'd ask my judge as a voter is, are you willing to take the risk, even a 1.5% risk, that a reactor will melt down near your home?
More importantly, are you willing to say no to Leonardo DiCaprio?
Exactly. So I mean, 26 partial meltdowns worldwide. I mean, that's not even including all the other less severe, but still very serious accidents that have occurred. The 1.5% statistic is incredibly strong, and it's been verified that, but the big thing, the impact that you really need to have, because they're going to talk about on the other side, they're going to talk about air pollution, and they're going to talk about other industrial accidents from fossil fuel plants. One, I mean, you're not advocating for fossil fuels, but second of all, if you're in a fire, we can at least treat you if you didn't die immediately. When radiation damages cells, though, it's completely irreversible. There's nothing we can do for you. I mean, you're dead. And your children will be affected if you do survive. I mean, there's all sorts of harms from radiation poisoning.
On a semi-related note, kind of an independent argument that I do think is important as kind of a change of pace for the con is the idea of harms to indigenous and other marginalized people. The big article on this is going to come from Kine and Boland 2016 from NCBI is where we downloaded it, and you can take a look at it. But basically the idea is that nuclear production in the United States, and really all over the world, but especially in the United States, the burdens of nuclear power production fall overwhelmingly on people of color, people from marginalized communities, and Native Americans. So a summary of this comes from Ababago, I think is how you say the name, in 2018, published by Stanford. And what it talks about, just to give you a few examples, it's a really good article and you should read the whole thing. For example, there's a much larger percentage of African Americans living within a 50-mile radius of nuclear power plants. And the reason this is important, and he points back to the Kynes study, is that black Americans are almost 2 times as likely as white Americans to live within what's called the Emergency Planning Zone, or the EPZ, for a nuclear catastrophe. So 17% of African Americans, as opposed to 10% of white Americans, live in this area that, if we were to have another Chernobyl, or we were to have another 3 Mile Island or something along those lines, would be the area where you would, be at risk of dying or cancer or something like that. In addition to that, minority and poverty level communities often include higher percentages of women and children who are both more sensitive to ionizing radiation. So if there were going to be any harm there, it would fall upon them. Even if that's not enough for you, though, even bigger is the use of indigenous lands in the United States for mining of uranium. What we see is that a huge portion of uranium mining in the United States goes on, often without consent, or at least without meaningful consent, from indigenous people in places like the Black Hills and the Four Corners regions. There are allegations, they call this nuclear colonialism, nuclear racism. The tangible impact of it, though, is, for example, cancer risks. Native American uranium miners face 14 times the normal lung cancer risk, mostly associated with uranium mining. U.S. nuclear facility owners are legally allowed to expose their workers to radiation 50 times higher than the amount for members of the public. So what you see is that these groups are having their lands essentially used for a highly hazardous and highly toxic activity that results in greater cancer risk. And that's just, on an empathic level, an emotional level, and a policy level, not a good thing. Again, another good change of pace argument to kind of get away from the straight environmental, straight policy kind of stuff. So
yeah, real quick, to circle back to this idea of safety issues, I was actually looking at these less than a meltdown type accidents that we've have seen with nuclear worldwide. Found a good source from the Journal of Contemporary Asia, which I don't really know what the context is there. I mean, basically they're looking at whether they should have nuclear power in Asia, and they're looking at all the disasters that have happened from nuclear worldwide, or even just accidents. And they found that between 1959 and 2009, there have been 99 accidents worldwide. So really good source to use there. Just to put in contrast, this isn't something that happens rarely. I mean, we make the black swan argument that you never see nuclear accidents. It's super rare. It's really not super rare. And the other interesting statistic is more than 2/3 of the disasters have happened in the United States.
Oh, nice. So another one that's kind of obvious, but I think that you definitely want to consider as part of your case, and and to be fair, on the con, there are enough different arguments that you might consider sort of getting away from the traditional 3 contention structure and maybe using 4 or even 5 shorter ones just to make them cover more. But for example, nuclear waste is an obvious one we need to talk about. The big point, and you can find this from a number of sources. This is from a Stanford University report. Just points out that nuclear waste, normally speaking, is something that's going to hang around and be harmful and be problematic for many, many generations to come. For example, I think this is plutonium-239, has a half-life of 24,000 years, and other things have half-lives of up to, for example, 15.7 million years. These are things that are going to be radioactive. They're going to be harmful to life long, long, long after we're gone. And you can kind of get into some intergenerational justice arguments here, like we burn this stuff up, we get the benefits, we have cheaper power, right? This is something we talked about on previous topics. We get all of the benefits today, and all of the costs are left for literally hundreds of generations of people to deal with. And that's exacerbated by the fact, as Alicia has mentioned to me, that we don't really have a very good plan for what to do with nuclear waste. It's not lying out there on the street, but it's not being dealt with in the way that you would expect.
Oh yeah, I have a source on that. This comes from Chemical and Engineering News, something I read frequently in my major, and the title is Radioactive Waste Stranded as U.S. Shifts from Nuclear Energy. And what it talks about is when plants are decommissioned, or even when plants are still in operation, the fuel gets stored, or the nuclear waste gets stored right there on site, either in ponds, like encased in cask and then put at the bottom of water to keep it cool.
This was
or
amazing.
in a concrete tower.
This was amazing to me. Like, I just assumed it was buried like in the Earth's core or something.
No, and then half the time they don't even have anyone guarding it. So if you have a decommissioned plant, I mean, they've got a fence and a lock and a keep out, but you have this radioactive material just sitting there unguarded. And if someone had bad intentions, I mean, they could make a dirty bomb with this stuff. Like, it's not even joking. We could have nuclear terrorism, and we're not doing anything about it.
And the other thing about it is, we in the United States have tried to figure out long-term storage solutions, but we haven't been able to do that. So, for example, the place where we're supposed to put all of our nuclear waste was the Yucca Mountain facility, right? This was supposed to be the place where we were going to have spent fuel and radioactive military waste. But as Madres noted way back in 2011, and actually it's actually good that this is old, because way back in 2011 he pointed out that the inventory of spent fuel in the United States was 62,000 metric tons. And if you took that, that would fill Yucca Mountain up and actually overfill it. So the facility that we were building, that we were looking at and considering, which we haven't, Yucca Mountain is not active, it has not been used yet, it may, who knows, it may never be used, right? But the big answer we had for nuclear waste, or at least part of it, would not be enough to hold the nuclear waste that we have right now sitting around in these concrete casks, sitting at the bottom of pools. We don't know what we're going to do over the long term. And I think one intuitive argument that the con can make is like, look, we've got stuff that is absolutely deadly and lethal to life, right? Now, I know that like right now we think we've got it under control in these casks, but what happens if tomorrow, we have a major war or something, right? What happens if tomorrow we have some kind of disaster that sets society back considerably? Do you think our first priority is going to be to go out and like maintain these little casks that are sitting around at nuclear sites? I mean, no, it's not. And yet we're creating this risk that's going to be sitting there for thousands of years, and we don't have a plan for what we are actually going to do with it long term. And one argument can be judged until we've got a real long-term viable plan that we know what we're going to do with this stuff. You cannot morally say more nuclear.
Oh, there's a justice argument on that too, because I mean, it's the general idea. We store dangerous things or build dangerous things in communities of color. But more importantly, the fun thing is when you buy nuclear energy as a consumer, like through your electric bill, you're actually paying for it to be stored somewhere safe. But it's not being stored there. So you paid for something you haven't gotten.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I think that there is a gut level argument that unless and until we have a plan for what we're going to do with this toxic stuff that threatens 100 generations from now, that we're paying for but we're not getting, right? We just can't do this, right? And so to kind of cut through some of the noise. A couple of arguments that I am not super sold on for the con, and then I'll throw it back to Alicia.
Yeah, I've got one more good argument.
She's got more good arguments. Let me get my two bad arguments out of the way. Proliferation. Now, there's a common argument that, we need to not have nuclear plants because the fissile material can get stolen. We're not really talking about proliferation like mainly like nation states like North Korea. We're talking about terrorist groups, people who would like to steal it, make a small bomb, make a dirty bomb, something along those lines. A small bomb that can only blow up, 20 city blocks, right? But I'm not convinced that this particular resolution is the best vehicle for that, because under this resolution, we're not getting rid of all nuclear power under any circumstances. And we may be expanding it somewhat, but it's not clear like where the threshold is, where the, I hate to say it, but bright line is, right, as to why this is going to be more risky. I mean, people who are going to steal nuclear material are going to go to the least secure places, which is why historically we've seen them trying to steal it from places in like Russia, right? So if the United States has 10% more or 10% less nuclear power, it's hard to see like exactly where the brink is there, like why they're going to suddenly start stealing from us because we have a little more or a little less, when their targets are almost certainly going to be places where you have less security. So I'm not really sold on the proliferation argument. I think it's just a lot of links that you have to make for not a huge impact. The second thing I'm not super crazy about is the argument about just nuclear disasters. Now again, we talked about this earlier, the idea that yes, Chernobyl killed tens of thousands of people over time as a result of cancer, arguably. Fukushima, according to Our World in Data, had 573 deaths. But again, if you look back to the statistics we talked about earlier about total deaths per units of energy, right? What you're going to see is these disasters really are, few and far between. And we're getting safer all the time. And overall, it's sort of like a plane crash. It's spectacular, in the sense that it's, noticeable, but it's not something that is creating a regular number of deaths around the world. So I'm just not super sold on the idea of disasters. I think there are good stats to hit back on that. So.
Yeah, so the last thing I have is an environmental argument, and I think that's something that's good to have in this realm because the affirmative is going to say that nuclear is clearly the triumphing choice on the environmental front. But what we see is that water usage is something that is a huge issue with nuclear, and it's not something they're going to think to cover. So this comes from courts in 2019, and what we see is that for every megawatt hour of energy produced, nuclear uses 1,101 gallons of water. That's more than coal, that's more than natural gas, that's certainly more than renewables. And the reason this is important, the impact for you, is that many cities in the United States are already facing severe water crises, and as climate change continues, it's only going to get worse. So some cities that you can name drop: Phoenix, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, El Paso, Miami, Atlanta. And once again, that point that climate change, like the part that's already happening and already irreversible, is only going to make this worse.
Okay, so final thoughts. Again, it's a good balanced topic. The one thing I would say is that in March, a lot of the time, especially in public forum, this is the time of year where we're doing, for example, qualifiers for NSDA Nationals, which is super important. You want to get there, obviously. Even if you're the best team in the state, you still got to make it through that qualifier, you know, and you've got to be good round after round. State championships sometimes happen at this time of year. You know, so there's a good possibility you're going to be debating this topic in front of community judges, lay judges, people who, you know, don't judge debate all the time. And even if they do, you know, the topics are changing every month at this time of year. So most of your judges will be new to this when you debate it in front of them. That means you need to take the time to do exactly what Alicia was talking about earlier, which is translate the jargon and the concepts into straightforward narratives. Instead of talking, you know, purely in jargon from cards and quotes and things like that, be able to explain, you know, something simple, which is like, look, there is only one way to reliably generate the power we need to reduce climate change. That's not coming from me, that's coming from the IPCC. That is the source you're going to want to be looking at the end of the round, that kind of stuff, right? Clear sources, clear conclusions that cut through the jargon and tell the story very simply. So think about what those are. I like to call these the cutting the Gordian knot. The Gordian knot is a story of a tangled knot that was so tangled up that you could only break it by cutting through it with a sword, right? Think about what your not cutting evidence and what your not cutting arguments are for the final focus, right? What are the things that you can say in a couple of sentences to make the narrative really clear? On topics like this, again, with judges who may be very new, those kind of cut the knot, make it clear, 2 or 3 sentence bullet point kind of talking points are going to be super important. So be ready to do those. That's my big thought for this one.
Yeah, the thought I have is that we need to take nothing for granted. Like, you can't just walk in there and not establish climate change as the biggest impact, or you can't just walk in there and assume that we can do 100% renewable. You can't just walk in there and assume that all of the replacements will be 100% renewable. You have to have a source for everything. So you really need to think through what you're advocating in your case and what each contention rests on. So if your point is that nuclear is bad, you better be ready to say, but renewables are good, we can do it today, everything is in place, let's go.
So with that, we, as always, wish you guys the best of luck. It's going to be an interesting month, a lot of meaningful tournaments for you folks. Above all, remember, debate is supposed to be fun, and debate is for everybody. So without further ado, we'll just say our usual, work hard, have fun, and hail state.